President Cyril Ramaphosa says there are further plans in place to help build the economy. His comments follow news that the country's GDP declined by 51% in the second quarter. Ramaphosa says the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on the economy should spur all South Africans to do all they can to help rebuild the country. He reminded the nation that countries across the world are also facing significant economic disruption. Ramaphosa says he'll make an announcement about a presidential employment stimulus initiative, which will begin next month. Its aim is to expand opportunities through public and social employment programs to fight job losses. Well, let's unpack those GDP figures now. We're joined by Investec's chief economist, Annabelle Bishop. Annabelle, good evening, and thank you so much for your time tonight. When one looks at the state of play, there certainly seems to be very bad news on the horizon, barring one or two, perhaps, silver linings. Your own impressions today, now that we know what the state of the economy is?
Yes, hello, hi. Look, I think certainly a very, very negative outcome, dropped by 50%. Quite shocking. And of course, if you have a look at this 50% contraction, well, 51% to be precise, 31% was from household consumption expenditure. And that really shows you that we saw a sharp drop in the ability of consumers to purchase goods and services in the second quarter, not just because of the restrictions and the lockdowns preventing the purchase of many goods and services in certain months, but also, of course, as well, the fact that incomes this year will be substantially lower than last year, and of course, substantial number of people losing their jobs as well, and of course, a very, very poor outcome overall.
When we look at agriculture, it seems to be the only sector that's in the green there. Farmers were talking a lot about how they're coming under increased strain over the lockdown period. What do you think is driving then that figure?
Look, certainly we had a very good maize harvest, and of course, that's such good news for us at this time, but sadly not enough to counter the big negative from other sectors. And of course, we saw an 11% contraction in terms of fixed investment. And with this very significant state-induced lockdown we saw in the second quarter of this year, little to no reason for any firms to invest and expand, because obviously their business activity was cut off by the government regulations. So too, in turn, obviously we have seen an impact on unemployment. Of course, the agricultural sector was one of the key sectors that was an essential service, and of course, essential products being produced, and of course they were allowed to continue to operate. And that really does show through in these figures. Really the only sector which actually produced a positive growth rate.
When we look at those figures, and in particular manufacturing and construction, we can see just how big the losses there also are. The president, in many of his speeches, when he talks about what is going to ignite the country's economy, he very much points to the infrastructure plan that the state has. Do the numbers gel up? So when you look at what is on the government agenda in terms of the role that infrastructure can play in stimulating the economy, and what the numbers are actually saying to us today?
Look, certainly if we have a look at the figures, 360 billion planned in terms of infrastructure spend, and of course the anticipation will create 275,000 jobs. The concern certainly here, of course, is that, this is a figure which is going to be spread over several years. It's not for this year. And of course, as well, figures that were already announced in the February budget. So no, I'm worried that's not going to be enough in terms of combating, the economic contraction. We obviously saw a very sharp contraction in the second quarter. So of course, we will see a little bit of an expansion in the third quarter, statistical base effect, you will rise somewhat. And of course, we are seeing some sectors starting to see some mild recovery. But if we really want to see extremely strong economic growth and very substantial employment in the South African economy, we need to see good governance from the government, certainly. But of course, also as well, we really need to see an environment where we have a low level of regulations on the private business sector. And of course, not complex regulations either. We need to promote and improve the ease of doing business so we can have substantially more wealthy people in the economy and reduce inequality and poverty. We really need to drive up economic growth strongly in South Africa and, of course, create employment for as many people as possible. We really need to see unemployment drop to single digits. And sadly, this is not going to happen if we don't spur business confidence and, of course, improve the ease of doing business. And one of the key factors of here as well is improving electricity supply.
South Africans would be worried tonight seeing these numbers about what it means for them over the next 3 months, over the next 6 months, over the next year really, and the ability that they will have to be able to still have some kind of livelihood and provide for their families.
And I think that is one of the really severe problems with this economic lockdown that we've seen. These restrictions have been so harsh and so damaging. You've seen a much worse lockdown than many other areas of the world. And of course, if you have a look at COVID-19 itself, it really only impacts the very old and sick. And of course, the majority of our population is young. And that is why we have one of the lowest fatality rates around the world. As you know, there was little to no social distancing in many of the highly populated areas of the South African economy. And of course, you know, the reality of the situation is we've had this destructive lockdown that has really damaged the economy. And now, of course, you know, consumers looking forward for the rest of the year have got damaged finances. Very high rates of unemployment, yes, certainly. But also, of course, as well, a situation where unemployment will carry on remaining high for the rest of this year and only come down slightly. We saw a figure of 30% in the first quarter of this year. The risk is that we now go to 35 to 37%. And this is a big worry because it really means that there will be great suffering for the majority of the people in South Africa.
Eskom has been identified as one of the greatest risks to this country's economy. So all things staying the same then over the next year, load shedding, we're told, is going to stay with us literally for the next 2 years or so. What then happens to any prospects of driving the economy in a different direction?
Look, certainly the energy availability factor, you know, how Eskom measures its ability to provide electricity to the economy, and of course, you know, as a percentage of its total ability, if it weren't having all these shutdowns, if it wasn't having load shedding, these unplanned outages, you know, the reality of the situation is that we're going to see load shedding certainly for the next year, if not 2 years, and that's because there has been great problems at Medupi and Kusile, poor build, you know, the insufficient certainly ability to obviously provide an efficient electricity station and structures. And you know, the reality of the situation is shortages of electricity supply mean that you're going to have a slower economic recovery. We find ourselves with industrial production contracting by 73% in the second quarter, and that of course your electricity manufacturing and mining sector. We're not going to get back to the level of economic activity we had at the end of last year in the fourth quarter of 2019 before 2023, and that is the reality of what has happened in terms of this very harsh lockdown. And even still, with such a cut-off in terms of economic activity, we still are having insufficient electricity supply.
So when it comes then to the general economic climate in the country, let's say small businesses that are currently operating right now and want to know what to realistically expect then within the next 2 quarters of the year, and especially going into 2021, what would you tell them, Annabelle?
Look, certainly we expect that we will see a rebound in economic activity of about 16.3% in the third quarter. It doesn't help when you've had a contraction of 50%, but of course that is part of the reason for this rebound is statistical base effect. Now, looking into the fourth quarter of this year, we could see growth of maybe another 5-6%. So certainly the economy is going to improve and grow from its low point reached in April this year. And really we're seeing each month, from a month-on-month growth perspective, a lift in economic activity. But you know, I would certainly say to listeners that, you know, we are unlikely to return to the strength of the economy that we had at the end of last year for several years yet. And of course, as we know, even economic activity last year was very weak, only economic growth of 0.2%, a downward trend in economic activity since 2011. Yes, because of the restrictions in terms of electricity supply, having insufficient electricity, but a number of other issues as well, such as excessive and overly complex government regulation, which has stifled business activity in South Africa. So, you know, of course, what we could look forward to in the year ahead is if government does provide us some quick wins and certainly reducing the complexity and the onerous burden of state regulation by eliminating red tape. This can be done quickly and easily. We've seen the ability of government in the COVID-19 lockdowns to rewrite legislation, to bring in, you know, quick changes on the regulatory front, and that can now be applied to red tape to stimulate business activity and to prompt the business sector in South Africa to hire more individuals, which in turn will have a positive multiplier effect and of course then lead into greater job creation, incomes, and of course demand and expenditure.
All right.